A warrior's peace. Taken as a prisoner of war, Lady Juliana of Thornwick expected nothing but cruelty from Sir Rhys Montrose, her captor. Instead, he studied her with unsettling curiosity. "You are meant to despise me, my lady," he murmured. "Tell me, must we remain enemies?" Chapter 1. The Falcon and the Cage. The chill of the stones seeped through Juliana's thin woolen gown, a constant, gnawing reminder of her captivity. 3 days. 3 days since the clash at Oakhaven. 3 days since she'd last seen the banners of Thornwick flying proudly. 3 days since she'd become a prize of war, a pawn in the endless game between noble houses. She huddled deeper into the meager furs provided, the scent of damp earth and something vaguely animal clinging to them, a far cry from the lavender-strewn linens of her own chambers. The chamber itself was surprisingly spacious, if stark. A narrow window, barred and high, offered a sliver of gray sky, perpetually veiled in mist. The walls were bare, save for a single, flickering torch sconce that cast dancing shadows, making the room feel both vast and claustrophobic. A simple wooden stool, a rough-hewn table bearing a chipped ewer and basin, and the pallet of furs in the corner constituted her entire world now. It was a gilded cage, perhaps, but a cage nonetheless. Juliana traced the outline of a crack in the stone floor, her fingers following its jagged path like a cartographer charting an unknown land. She'd always been drawn to details, finding solace in the small, tangible things when the world around her felt overwhelming. It was a habit born of necessity, a way to maintain control in a life dictated by duty and expectation. Lady Juliana of Thornwick. The title felt hollow now, a mockery in these cold, unfamiliar surroundings. She was the eldest daughter of Lord Alaric, a man whose name commanded respect, even fear, throughout the borderlands. Her life had been one of carefully orchestrated alliances, of learning the intricate dance of courtly manners, of preparing for a marriage that would secure Thornwick's future. Love had never been a consideration. Duty, always duty, had been the guiding star of her existence. A sudden clang echoed from the corridor outside, followed by the heavy tread of booted feet. Juliana's heart quickened, a frantic bird beating against its ribs. She rose, smoothing down her gown, a futile attempt to regain some semblance of composure. The iron door creaked open, revealing a guard, his face obscured by the shadow of his helmet. He held a tray laden with food, a chunk of dark bread, a bowl of something steaming, and a goblet of what she hoped was wine. He set the tray down on the table with a thud, his eyes, the only visible part of his face, scanning her briefly before he turned to leave. "Wait," Juliana said, her voice surprisingly steady. "Who is your lord? Who holds me captive?" The guard paused, his hand on the door. "Sir Rhys Montrose," he said, his voice muffled by the helmet. "You are his prisoner." The name sent a shiver down her spine. Montrose. The Lion of the North, they called him. A warrior of legendary skill and ruthless reputation. A man who had built his power on conquest and bloodshed. A man who was now her jailer. She'd heard tales of him, whispered in hushed tones around the hearth fires at Thornwick. Tales of his daring raids, his unwavering loyalty to his king, and his unconventional methods. The guard departed, leaving her alone with the name and the unsettling weight of its implications. Juliana approached the tray, her stomach twisting with a mixture of hunger and apprehension. She broke off a piece of the bread, its texture coarse and unfamiliar. The stew, she discovered, was surprisingly palatable, thick with vegetables and some kind of meat she couldn't identify. It warmed her from the inside, a small comfort in the face of her overwhelming uncertainty. As she ate, she tried to recall everything she knew about Sir Rhys Montrose. He was relatively young, younger than her father at least. He'd risen to prominence quickly, distinguishing himself in the recent wars against the northern clans. He was unmarried, a rarity among men of his standing. And he was known to be unpredictable. That was the word that kept surfacing in the whispers she'd overheard. Unpredictable, and therefore dangerous. She finished the meal, the silence of the chamber pressing down on her. The wine, thankfully, was strong and helped to numb the sharp edges of her fear. She wrapped herself in the furs again, trying to find some warmth, some semblance of security. Sleep, when it finally came, was fitful and filled with fragmented images. The clash of steel, the terrified faces of her men, the cold, gray eyes of the knight who had pulled her from her horse. She woke with a start, her heart pounding. The lingering image of those eyes burned into her memory. The next day passed in much the same way. The guard brought her meals, offering no conversation, no explanation. She spent the hours pacing the confines of her chamber, her mind racing, trying to devise some plan, some way to escape. But the walls were thick, the door was solid, and the window was far too high to reach. It was on the third evening, as the light outside was fading, that he finally came. The door opened, and this time, it wasn't the guard. A figure stood silhouetted against the torchlight in the corridor, tall and imposing. He stepped into the room, and Juliana's breath caught in her throat. Sir Rhys Montrose. He was younger than she'd expected, though the lines etched around his eyes and mouth hinted at a life lived hard. His hair was dark, almost black, and fell to his shoulders in loose waves. His face was lean and angular, with a strong jaw and a nose that had likely been broken more than once. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were the color of a stormy sea, a swirling mix of gray and blue, and they seemed to pierce through her, seeing everything, hiding nothing. He wore a simple tunic of dark green, unadorned save for the silver lion rampant emblazoned on his chest. A sword hung at his hip, its hilt worn smooth with use. He moved with a grace that belied his size, a predator's awareness in every step. He stopped a few feet from her, his gaze sweeping over her, taking in every detail. Juliana felt a blush rise to her cheeks, a mixture of anger and a strange, unsettling awareness. "Lady Juliana," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very stones of the chamber. It was not unkind, but neither was it welcoming. It was assessing. She lifted her chin, meeting his gaze. "Sir Rhys," she replied, her voice surprisingly steady. "I believe it is customary to offer a guest, even a captive one, some explanation for their detention." A flicker of something amusement crossed his face. "You are a prisoner of war, my lady. Surely that is explanation enough." "I am a lady of Thornwick," Juliana retorted, her pride flaring. "I am not a common soldier. My family will pay a ransom. You will be well compensated for my safe return." He tilted his head, studying her. "Your father is a formidable man, Lord Alaric, but he is also a stubborn one. I doubt he will be eager to part with his gold, even for his beloved daughter." Juliana's heart sank. He was right. Her father was proud, and he would see this as a sign of weakness. He would negotiate, of course, but it would be a long, drawn-out process, and in the meantime, what do you intend to do with me? She asked, her voice losing some of its defiance. He took a step closer, and she instinctively recoiled. He stopped, a shadow of something that might have been regret crossing his face. "I have not yet decided," he said, his voice softer now. "You are different than I expected." "Different how?" Juliana asked, wary of his words, of the way he looked at her. It wasn't the leering gaze of a conqueror, but something far more unsettling. It was as if he were trying to see beneath her skin, to understand something that even she didn't fully comprehend. He didn't answer her question directly. Instead, he said, "You are meant to despise me, my lady. You are meant to curse my name and pray for my downfall." Juliana looked away, her gaze falling on the flickering torchlight. She should despise him. He was her enemy, the man who had brought her to this place, who held her fate in his hands. But there was something in his voice, in his eyes, that gave her pause. A hint of weariness? Resignation? "Tell me," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "must we remain enemies?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy and unanswered. Juliana looked up at him, her heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. She saw not a monster, not a ruthless conqueror, but a man, burdened by something she couldn't yet name. And in that moment, The carefully constructed walls around her heart began to crumble, just a little. The unknown beckoned. Chapter 2. Whispers of Montrose. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the crackle of the torch and the frantic beat of Juliana's own heart. She found herself searching his face, trying to decipher the meaning behind his unexpected question. Was it a trick? A ploy to lower her guard? Or was it something more genuine? I do not know, she finally answered, her voice barely above a whisper. It was the truth. She should hate him, should cling to the righteous anger that had sustained her these past few days. But his presence, his words, had stirred something within her, a flicker of curiosity. He nodded slowly, as if accepting her answer, though his eyes never left hers. You have courage, Lady Juliana. I admire that. It was a strange compliment, coming from her captor. And yet, it warmed her a small spark in the cold darkness of her confinement. Courage is often born of necessity, Sir Rhys, she replied, her voice gaining a little strength. He smiled then, a fleeting, almost imperceptible curve of his lips, but it transformed his face, softening the harsh lines and making him appear even younger. Perhaps, he conceded. But it is still a virtue, nonetheless. He turned away from her, walking towards the narrow window, his back to her. Juliana watched him, her mind still reeling. This was not the brutal warlord she had expected. This was a man of contradictions, of hidden depths. Tell me about Thornwick, he said, his voice echoing slightly in the chamber. The request surprised her. Why? She asked, suspicion lacing her tone. What interest do you have in my home? He glanced back at her, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. I am a curious man, my lady. And your home is legendary. It is said to be one of the strongest fortresses in the borderlands. Juliana hesitated. She was wary of revealing anything that could be used against her family, against Thornwick. But she also sensed that refusing to answer would only deepen his suspicions. It is old, she said slowly, choosing her words carefully. Built on the foundations of an ancient Roman fort. It has withstood many sieges. And your family? He prompted, turning back to face her fully. Lord Alaric is known for his unwavering loyalty to the crown. Juliana felt a surge of pride, mixed with a familiar pang of resentment. Her father's loyalty was absolute, unyielding. It had shaped their lives, dictated their choices. It had also cost them dearly. He is a loyal man, she agreed, her voice tight. He believes in duty, in honor. And you, Lady Juliana? He asked, his voice softening. Do you share your father's convictions? The question caught her off guard. It was a question she had often asked herself, in the quiet solitude of her own chambers. Did she believe in the same things her father did? Or was she simply following the path that had been laid out for her? She began, then hesitated. I believe in protecting those I care for, she finally said, choosing her words carefully. In doing what is right, even when it is difficult. He nodded, as if satisfied with her answer. Noble sentiments, he murmured. But sometimes, duty and what is right are not the same thing. His words struck a chord within her, resonating with a long-held, unspoken doubt. She had always struggled with the rigid expectations of her life, with the sacrifices that were demanded of her. She had learned to hide her true feelings, to present a facade of obedience and acceptance. But beneath the surface, a rebellious spirit simmered. What do you believe in, Sir Rhys? She asked, her voice bolder now. She wanted to understand him, to peel back the layers of reputation and rumor and see the man beneath. He was silent for a moment, his gaze distant, as if he were looking back at something far away. I believe in survival, he said finally, his voice low and gravelly. In protecting my people, in securing a future for those who depend on me. It was a surprisingly honest answer, devoid of the usual boasts of honor and glory. It spoke of a harsh reality, of a life lived on the edge, where every decision could mean the difference between life and death. And what of love? She asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. It was a foolish question, perhaps, but she couldn't help herself. She wanted to know if there was any room in his life for something other than war and duty. His expression changed, a flicker of something that might have been pain crossing his face. He looked away, his jaw tightening. "Love is a luxury, my lady," he said, his voice harsh. "One that a man in my position can ill afford." The answer saddened her, though she wasn't sure why. She had always believed that love was something to be avoided, a weakness that could be exploited. But hearing him say it, seeing the raw emotion in his eyes, made her question her own beliefs. He turned back to her, his gaze intense. "You are a valuable prisoner, Lady Juliana," he said, his voice regaining its earlier composure. "Your family will pay a handsome ransom for your return. But until then, you'll be treated with respect. You will have everything you need, within reason." She nodded, her throat tight. It was more than she had expected, and yet, it didn't ease the ache in her heart. She was still a prisoner, still separated from everything she knew and loved. "I will leave you now," he said, turning towards the door. "The guard will bring you fresh water and anything else you require." He paused at the door, looking back at her. "Sleep well, Lady Juliana," he said, his voice softer now. "And try not to dream of dragons." He left, the door closing behind him with a heavy thud. Juliana stood there for a long moment, the echo of his words ringing in her ears. Try not to dream of dragons. What did he mean by that? Was it a threat? A warning? Or something else entirely? She walked over to the table and poured herself a goblet of wine, her hand trembling slightly. She drank deeply, the liquid fire warming her from the inside. She needed to be strong, to be clear-headed. She needed to find a way to survive this, to navigate the treacherous waters of her captivity. As she settled back onto the furs, she found herself thinking not of dragons, but of the man who had just left her chamber. Sir Rhys Montrose, the Lion of the North, her captor, and yet something more. She closed her eyes and the whispers started, names of battles won, of land conquered, of a knight unyielding and without mercy. But now, intermingled with those whispers were new ones, of a weariness in storm-gray eyes, of a soft question asked in the still of the night, a question that has taken root deep inside her heart, wondering, whispering, must we remain enemies? And in the darkness of the stone room a spark, fragile and new, flickered. Chapter 3. The Weight of a Name. The days that followed settled into a strange, uneasy rhythm. Juliana remained confined to her chamber, but her treatment was far from harsh. The guard, a taciturn man named Gareth, brought her meals regularly, the food surprisingly varied and well prepared. He also provided her with fresh water for washing, a few simple toiletries, and even a selection of books from the castle library, a gesture that surprised and somewhat disarmed her. She spent her hours reading, pacing, and staring out the narrow window, watching the changing patterns of the clouds. She tried to exercise, stretching her limbs in the confines of the chamber, trying to maintain some semblance of physical strength. But her mind was constantly restless, turning over and over the events of the past few weeks, replaying her conversations with Sir Rhys, searching for clues, for any hint of his true intentions. He visited her several times, always in the evening, after the castle had quieted down. Their conversations were guarded, cautious, but there was an undeniable undercurrent of something else. A tension, a curiosity, a mutual awareness that both intrigued and unsettled her. He spoke of his life, of the challenges of ruling his lands, of the constant threat of raids from the north. He spoke of his loyalty to his king, of his desire to bring peace and stability to the borderlands. He never spoke of his past, of any personal losses or triumphs, but she sensed a deep well of experience beneath his carefully controlled exterior. Juliana, in turn, spoke of her life at Thornwick, of her duties as the eldest daughter, of her training in needlework and music, of the endless rounds of social obligations. She carefully avoided mentioning anything that could be construed as weakness, anything that could be used against her family. But she found herself sharing small details, anecdotes about her younger siblings, memories of her childhood, things she hadn't thought about in years. It was during one of these conversations, as they were discussing the merits of different types of hunting falcons, that the weight of his name, the legacy he carried, truly struck her. Montrose, she said, the name feeling strange on her tongue. It is a name that carries weight. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. It is a name that has been earned, Lady Juliana, he said, his voice even. Through blood and sacrifice. Your father, she said, remembering the stories she'd heard. He was a legend. Sir Gareth Montrose, the previous Lion of the North. A man who had single-handedly held back a northern invasion. A man who had died defending his lands, his people. Rhys nodded, his gaze distant. He was a hard man, he said, his voice tinged with a mixture of respect and something else. Something that sounded like resentment. He demanded much of his sons. Juliana sensed a hidden story there, a story of a difficult childhood, of a father who had placed duty above all else. She wondered if Rhys had ever felt the weight of that expectation, the pressure to live up to his father's legacy. And your mother? She asked, venturing into more personal territory. His expression softened, a flicker of warmth in his eyes. She was a gentle soul, he said, his voice softer now. She tried to shield us from the harshness of our lives, as much as she could. Juliana could imagine it, the contrast between the stern, demanding father and the gentle, loving mother. It was a familiar dynamic, one she had witnessed in her own family. She died when I was young, he added, his voice barely a whisper. Of a fever. The simple statement carried a world of grief, a loss that still resonated within him. Juliana felt a pang of sympathy, a connection to him that transcended their roles as captor and captive. I am sorry, she said, her voice sincere. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. Thank you, he said, the words simple but heartfelt. They sat in silence for a moment, the unspoken understanding between them deepening. Juliana realized that she was beginning to see him not just as a warrior, not just as the man who held her prisoner, but as a human being with his own struggles, his own vulnerabilities. The weight of a name, she repeated quietly to break the solemn moment. She had been thinking of his family's expectations, but she also realized, with a pang, of her own. The weight of Thornwick. The weight of being the eldest, the responsible one. The weight of a future already planned. He looked at her, as if suddenly understanding. It is a burden we both carry, I think. He paused. Though perhaps for different reasons. She agreed silently. His, to uphold and avenge. Hers, to comply and secure. That night, as she lay in her bed, she thought about the conversation, about the glimpse of vulnerability he had allowed her to see. She thought about the weight of his name and the weight of her own. And she realized that, despite everything, she was beginning to feel something for him. Something more than fear, more than resentment. Something that felt dangerously close to respect. And a tiny, treacherous voice whispered in the back of her mind, perhaps even something more. The realization disturbed her, and before she could fully wrestle with it, sleep claimed her. A deep and restless slumber, where a lion with storm-gray eyes stalked through the halls of a familiar, yet distant, Thornwick. The air was thick with unshed tears and unspoken words. Chapter 4. Scars of the Past. The following days were marked by a subtle shift in Juliana's confinement. She was granted access to the castle courtyard, a small, walled garden where a few hardy herbs and flowers struggled to survive in the thin soil. It wasn't freedom, not by any means, but it was a welcome change from the confines of her chamber. The fresh air, the scent of earth and growing things, did much to lift her spirits. Gareth, the taciturn guard, remained her constant companion, his presence a silent reminder of her status. But he no longer seemed quite so menacing. He even offered her a gruff good morrow each day, a small gesture that spoke volumes. She spent her time in the courtyard walking, observing the birds that flitted among the branches of a gnarled old apple tree, and tending to the small patch of herbs. It was a soothing routine, a way to connect with the natural world, to escape, if only for a few hours, the reality of her captivity. One afternoon, as she was weeding around a cluster of rosemary bushes, she heard the sound of footsteps approaching. She looked up, expecting to see Gareth, but it was Sir Rhys who stood before her. He was dressed in riding clothes, his hair windblown, a smudge of dirt on his cheek. He looked younger, more approachable than he did in the formal setting of her chamber. "Lady Juliana," he said, a slight smile playing on his lips. "I see you are making the most of your limited freedom." She rose, brushing the dirt from her hands. "It is a welcome change," she admitted, "though I still long for the forests of Thornwick." He nodded, his gaze sweeping over the small garden. "I understand," he said. "This is but a poor substitute for the wild beauty of your home." He paused, then gestured towards a stone bench beneath the apple tree. "May I join you?" Juliana hesitated, then nodded. It was a strange request, almost courteous. She sat down on the bench, and he sat beside her, leaving a respectable distance between them. "I've been reviewing the terms of your ransom," he said, his voice serious. "Your father has responded to my initial offer." Juliana's heart quickened. This was what she had been waiting for, the first sign of progress towards her release. "And?" she prompted, trying to keep her voice steady. He sighed, his expression grim. "He is reluctant to meet my demands. He claims I ask too much." Juliana's hope faltered. She had known her father would be stubborn, but she had hoped. "What will you do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. "I will negotiate," he said. "I do not wish to prolong your captivity any longer than necessary." His words were reassuring, but she sensed a hidden meaning beneath them. He was not simply concerned about her well-being, she realized. He had other reasons for wanting to resolve this situation. "There is something else, isn't there?" she asked, her intuition guiding her. He hesitated, then nodded. "There are rumors," he said, his voice low. "Whispers of a possible alliance between your father and Lord Elmsworth." Elmsworth. The name sent a chill down her spine. He was a ruthless, ambitious lord, a rival of Montrose, a man who would stop at nothing to expand his power. "En alliance?" Juliana repeated, her mind racing. "But that would mean war." He nodded grimly. "It would. And it would be a war that neither of us can afford." Juliana understood the implications. An alliance between Thornwick and Elmsworth would shift the balance of power in the borderlands, threatening Montrose's lands, his people. It would be a devastating conflict, one that would leave countless dead and the region in ruins. "My father would not," she began, then stopped. She wanted to believe that her father would never agree to such a thing, but she knew his ambition, his unwavering loyalty to the crown. He would do whatever he thought was necessary to protect Thornwick, even if it meant plunging the region into war. "He might," Rhys said, his voice heavy, "if he believes it is the only way to secure your release and to ensure the future of his lineage." Juliana felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach. She was the key to this alliance, the pawn in a dangerous game. Her fate, the fate of the entire region, rested on her father's decision. "I must speak to him," she said, her voice urgent. "I must convince him not to do this." Rhys looked at her, his expression a mixture of sympathy and something else. Something that looked like admiration. "I wish it were that simple," he said. "But your father is not a man who is easily swayed." He paused, then reached out and touched her hand, his fingers brushing against hers. It was a brief, fleeting touch, but it sent a jolt of electricity through her. She looked up at him, startled by the sudden intimacy. He met it with a searching gaze, and Juliana found herself drowning for a moment. The touch held for a moment, and, before she had the presence of mind to pull away, he did. He withdrew his hand, his expression shifting, becoming more guarded. "I have scars, Lady Juliana," he said, his voice low and rough. "Scars that you cannot see. Scars from the past." She looked at him, puzzled. He was referring to something more than physical wounds, she realized. He was talking about emotional scars, the wounds that time could not heal. He glanced away, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "My father, he believed that weakness was a sin," he said, his voice tight. "He pushed me, hardened me, made me into the warrior I am today. But he also broke something within me. Juliana felt a pang of sympathy, a deeper understanding of the man beneath the armor. She saw the pain in his eyes, the weight of the burden he carried. She sensed that he was revealing something to her that he had never shared with anyone else. And as she began, then found she couldn't hold back. She thought of her own distant father, of a childhood spent more with tutors and ladies in waiting. I too have scars. Ones no one else can see. He turned at this, the surprise at her admission clear on his face. She swallowed. A betrothal, broken. Not by my choice. A man who was not what he seemed. She couldn't bring herself to speak of Lord Edmund's cruelty, of his wandering eyes and harsh words, not yet. But the memory of that broken engagement, the humiliation, the shame, still stung. He studied her, his gaze intense. I did not know, he said softly. She shrugged, a forced lightness in her tone. It is not something I speak of often. They sat in silence for a moment, the unspoken understanding between them growing stronger. Juliana realized that she had just shared something deeply personal with him, something she had never confided in anyone else. And she had done it not out of duty, not out of fear, but out of a genuine desire to connect with him, to let him see the real person beneath the title, beneath the facade. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves of the apple tree, and carrying with it the scent of distant rain. The weight of their shared pasts hung heavy in the air, a silent acknowledgement of the burdens they both carried, and a fragile, nascent hope that somehow, some way, those scars might be healed. Chapter 5. A glimmer in the shadows. The rain came in the night, a steady, drumming downpour that washed away the dust and grime of the day, leaving the air clean and fresh. Juliana woke to the sound of it, a soothing rhythm that calmed her restless spirit. She lay in bed, listening to the rain, thinking about her conversation with Rhys in the courtyard. His confession, his vulnerability, had surprised her. It had also deepened her understanding of him, her respect for him. She realized that he was not just a warrior, not just a captor, but a man with his own demons, his own struggles. And she, in turn, had revealed a part of herself she usually kept hidden, a vulnerability that felt both frightening and liberating. The guard, Gareth, brought her breakfast, his usual gruff demeanor softened by a hint of concern. He informed her that Sir Rhys had ridden out early that morning, despite the weather, to meet with his scouts. He would likely be gone for several days. Juliana felt a pang of disappointment. It was a strange reaction, considering he was her captor. But she had grown accustomed to their evening conversations, to the strange, unsettling connection that had developed between them. She missed his presence, his quiet intensity, the way he looked at her as if he were trying to see into her soul. She spent the day reading, trying to lose herself in the stories of ancient heroes and mythical creatures. But her mind kept wandering back to Rhys, to the rumors of war, to the precarious situation she found herself in. She worried about her family, about Thornwick, about the possibility of a devastating conflict. She also worried about Rhys. She knew he was a skilled warrior, a seasoned commander, but war was always a dangerous undertaking. And she realized, with a jolt of surprise, that she didn't want anything to happen to him. The thought disturbed her. She should want him to fail, should pray for his downfall. He was her enemy, the man who held her captive. But she couldn't deny the feelings that were stirring within her, the growing sense of connection, of something more. As the day wore on, the rain subsided, giving way to a pale, watery sunlight. Juliana ventured out into the courtyard, breathing in the fresh, rain-washed air. She walked along the perimeter wall, her gaze drawn to the distant hills, shrouded in mist. She longed for freedom, for the familiar landscape of her home, but she also felt a strange sense of belonging here, in this castle, with this man. It was a confusing, unsettling feeling, one that she couldn't quite reconcile with her sense of duty, with her loyalty to her family. She knew she should be plotting her escape, devising some plan to outwit her captor. But she found herself increasingly reluctant to do so. As evening approached, she returned to her chamber, feeling restless and uneasy. She lit a candle, the flickering flame casting dancing shadows on the stone walls. She tried to read, but the words blurred before her eyes. She paced the room, her mind racing, her heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm. Suddenly, she heard a noise outside her door, a soft scraping sound. She froze, her heart leaping into her throat. Was it Gareth? Or someone else? She held her breath, listening intently. The scraping sound came again, followed by a faint whisper. Lady Juliana? It was a woman's voice, low and hesitant. Juliana cautiously approached the door, her hand on the hilt of a small eating knife she had kept hidden beneath her pillow. Who is it? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. It is Alara, the voice replied. I am a servant here. I have a message for you. Juliana hesitated. She didn't recognize the name, but she sensed no immediate threat. She slowly opened the door, just a crack, keeping the chain fastened. A young woman stood in the dimly lit corridor, her face pale and anxious. She was small and slender, with dark hair pulled back in a simple braid. She wore a plain woolen gown, the uniform of a castle servant. What message? Juliana asked, her voice wary. Alara glanced nervously up and down the corridor, as if afraid of being seen. It is from your brother, she whispered. From Sir Edric. Juliana's heart leaped. Edric. Her younger brother, the impetuous, hot-headed one. What was he doing here? How did you get a message from him? She asked, her mind reeling. He is nearby, Alara said, her voice trembling. He sent me ahead. He wishes to speak with you. Juliana's mind raced. This could be a trap, a ploy by Elmsworth or even by Rhys himself. But she couldn't ignore the possibility that it was genuine, that her brother was actually here, risking his life to try and rescue her. Where is he? She asked, her voice urgent. He is waiting near the old chapel, Alara said. In the ruins, beyond the outer wall. He says he has a plan. The old chapel. Juliana knew the place. It was a crumbling ruin, long abandoned, located outside the main castle walls. It was a dangerous place, exposed and vulnerable. Can you take me to him? She asked, her heart pounding. Alara nodded, her eyes wide with fear. I can try, she whispered. But we must be careful. If we are caught, Juliana knew the risks. If they were discovered, it would mean certain punishment, perhaps even death. But she couldn't stay here, waiting passively for her father to negotiate her release. She had to take a chance, had to try to escape, even if it meant risking everything. A glimmer of hope, fragile but bright, pierced the shadows of her fear. She followed Alara's gaze to make sure the corridor remained clear, a silent promise passing between them. It was time to act. Chapter 6. The Serpent's Bargain. Alara led Juliana through a maze of dimly lit corridors, moving with a quiet urgency that betrayed her fear. They avoided the main thoroughfares, sticking to the back passages and servant stairwells, their footsteps barely making a sound on the stone floors. Juliana's heart pounded in her chest, a frantic drumbeat accompanying their clandestine journey. She clutched the small knife beneath her cloak, its cold steel a small comfort in the face of the unknown. She trusted Alara, or at least, she trusted the desperation in the young woman's eyes, the shared understanding of captivity, and the longing for freedom. But she also knew that she was stepping into a dangerous game, one where a single misstep could have dire consequences. They reached a small, postern gate, hidden behind a tapestry in a deserted corridor. Alara produced a key, her hand trembling slightly as she unlocked the gate. It creaked open, revealing a narrow passage that led to the outer bailey. The night air was cold and damp, a stark contrast to the stuffy warmth of the castle. The moon was hidden behind a thick layer of clouds, casting the bailey in deep shadow. Juliana followed Alara, her senses on high alert, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. They crossed the bailey, keeping to the shadows of the walls, their footsteps muffled by the damp grass. They reached the outer wall, a towering barrier of stone that separated the castle from the surrounding wilderness. Alara pointed towards a section of the wall where a large chunk of masonry had crumbled, creating a narrow opening. The chapel is just beyond, she whispered. Be careful. Juliana nodded, her throat tight with apprehension. She squeezed through the opening, her cloak snagging on the rough stone. She emerged on the other side, finding herself in an overgrown field, the ruins of the old chapel looming before her, a dark silhouette against the night sky. The chapel was a crumbling shell of its former glory, its roof long gone, its walls overgrown with ivy. It was a place of ghosts and shadows, a place where the past seemed to linger, a palpable presence. As Juliana approached the chapel, a figure emerged from the shadows, stepping into a patch of faint moonlight. Edric, she breathed, relief flooding through her. Her brother. He was thinner than she remembered, his face gaunt and pale, but his eyes still held the same fiery intensity. He wore a plain tunic and breeches, a sword at his hip, a bow and quiver slung across his back. He rushed towards her, embracing her tightly. Juliana, thank the heavens you are safe. Edric, what are you doing here? She asked, her voice a mixture of relief and concern. It is too dangerous. He released her, his expression grim. I could not leave you here, sister, he said. I had to try to rescue you. But how? I have allies, he said, his voice evasive. Men who are willing to help us. Juliana sensed a hidden story there, a story he was not yet ready to reveal. She also sensed a recklessness in him, a desperation that made her uneasy. We must go, he said, his voice urgent. We have little time. He led her into the chapel, the air inside cold and damp, the scent of decay heavy in the air. He gestured towards a section of the wall where a large stone had been dislodged, creating a narrow opening. This leads to a tunnel, he said. An old smuggler's passage. It will take us to the forest. Juliana hesitated. The tunnel was dark and forbidding. The thought of entering it filled her with a sense of claustrophobia. But she knew she had no choice. She had to trust her brother, had to believe that he had a plan. Suddenly, a voice spoke from the shadows, a smooth, silky voice that sent a shiver down Juliana's spine. Going somewhere, Lady Juliana? A figure stepped into the moonlight, a tall, slender man with a cruel smile and eyes that glittered like polished obsidian. Lord Elmsworth. Juliana's blood ran cold. She had feared this, had suspected that Edric was somehow involved with this man, but seeing him here, in this place, confirmed her worst fears. Elmsworth, she said, her voice trembling. What are you doing here? He chuckled, a cold, mirthless sound. I am here to offer you a bargain, my lady, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. A way out of your predicament. I want nothing to do with you, Juliana retorted, her voice filled with contempt. He ignored her, his gaze fixed on Edric. Your brother, it seems, has been less than truthful with you, he said. He has made certain promises, in exchange for my assistance. Edric avoided Juliana's gaze, his face flushed with shame. What promises? Juliana demanded, her voice rising. Elmsworth smiled, a predatory glint in his eyes. He has promised to deliver you to me, he said, as my bride. Juliana gasped, her mind reeling. Betrayed. Her own brother had betrayed her, had sold her to this vile man in exchange for his help. Edric, is this true? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Her brother finally looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and desperation. I had no choice, he stammered. It was the only way to get you out of here. You would sell me to this serpent? Juliana cried, her voice filled with anguish. He promised to help us defeat Montrose, Edric said, his voice pleading. To restore Thornwick to its rightful glory. Juliana stared at him, her heart breaking. She had always known her brother was impetuous, but she had never imagined he was capable of such treachery. Elmsworth stepped closer, his smile widening. Come, my lady, he said, his voice smooth and persuasive. Accept your fate. Become my wife, and you will be Queen of the North. Together, we will rule these lands, and Montrose will be crushed. Juliana looked at him, her eyes filled with hatred. She would rather die than become this man's wife, than be a party to his schemes. But she also knew that she was trapped, that she had no way out. Her brother had betrayed her, and she was surrounded by her enemies. Despair washed over her, a cold, dark wave that threatened to engulf her. The serpent had offered his bargain, and it seemed all hope was lost. Chapter 7. Echoes of Thornwick. Before Juliana could respond, before she could even fully process the depth of her brother's betrayal, a new voice cut through the tense silence. "I think not, Elmsworth." The voice was low, controlled, but filled with an undeniable authority. It was a voice Juliana knew well, a voice that sent a shiver of both fear and relief through her. "Rhys." He stepped out of the shadows, emerging from the darkness at the back of the chapel, his form silhouetted against the faint moonlight. He was dressed in his familiar dark tunic, his sword at his hip, his eyes blazing with a cold fury. He was not alone. Several of his men, Gareth among them, flanked him, their swords drawn, their faces grim. Elmsworth's smile vanished, replaced by a look of startled anger. "Montrose," he spat, his voice laced with venom. "What are you doing here?" "I might ask you the same question," Rhys replied, his voice dangerously calm. "This is my land, Elmsworth, and Lady Juliana is my prisoner." "She was promised to me," Elmsworth retorted, his hand moving towards his sword hilt. "By her own brother." Rhys's gaze flickered to Edric, his expression a mixture of contempt and pity. "Your brother has no authority to make such a promise," he said, his voice hard. "He is a fool and a traitor." Edric shrank back, his face pale and stricken. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. "This is none of your concern, Montrose," Elmsworth insisted, his voice rising. "Release the woman, and we will leave in peace." Rhys laughed, a cold, mirthless sound that echoed through the ruined chapel. "You think I would simply hand her over to you?" he said. "You underestimate me, Elmsworth. I have men waiting." Elmsworth threatened, his hand tightening on his sword. "We can take her by force." "You are welcome to try," Rhys replied, his voice unwavering. "But I promise you, it will be a costly endeavor." The two men faced each other, their eyes locked in a silent battle of wills. The tension in the air was palpable, the threat of violence hanging heavy in the silence. Juliana watched them, her heart pounding, her mind racing. She was caught in the middle of a deadly conflict, a pawn in a game between two powerful lords. She looked at Edric, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger and sorrow. She couldn't believe that he had done this, that he had betrayed her so completely. She felt a profound sense of loss, a shattering of the bond that had always existed between them. Suddenly, Rhys moved. He stepped forward, his sword flashing in the moonlight. Elmsworth reacted instinctively, drawing his own sword, the two blades clashing with a ringing sound. The fight was swift and brutal. Rhys was the superior swordsman, his movements fluid and precise, his attacks relentless. Elmsworth was skilled, but he was no match for the Lion of the North. Juliana watched in horrified fascination, her breath caught in her throat. She wanted to look away, but she couldn't. She was transfixed by the violence, by the raw power and fury on display. Within minutes, it was over. Rhys disarmed Elmsworth, his sword point pressed against the other man's throat. "Yield," Elmsworth, Rhys said, his voice cold and hard.
"Or die."
Elmsworth glared at him, his eyes filled with hatred, but he knew he was defeated. He slowly lowered his sword, his body trembling with rage and humiliation. Rhys stepped back, allowing Elmsworth to rise. "Leave," he said, his voice dismissive. "And take your allies with you." Elmsworth sheathed his sword, his face a mask of fury. He gestured to his men, who had remained hidden in the shadows, and they retreated, disappearing into the darkness. Rhys turned to Juliana, his expression softening slightly. "Are you unharmed, my lady?" he asked, his voice concerned. She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She was still reeling from the shock of what had happened, from the realization that her own brother had been willing to sacrifice her for his own ambitions. He looked at Edric, his expression hardening again. "Take him," he ordered his men. Gareth and another guard seized Edric, binding his hands. Edric didn't resist, his head hanging in shame. What will you do with him?" Juliana asked, her voice trembling. Rhys hesitated. He is your brother, he said. I will consider his fate. It was a small concession, but it was enough to give Juliana a flicker of hope. She knew that Rhys could be ruthless, but she also sensed a sense of justice in him, a reluctance to punish Edric simply for being her brother. They left the chapel, returning to the castle through the same secret passage. Juliana walked beside Rhys, her mind still reeling, her emotions in turmoil. She felt a strange mixture of gratitude and something else, something that felt dangerously close to trust. As they reached her chamber, Rhys paused at the door. Try to rest, my lady, he said, his voice softer now. You have been through much this night. He hesitated and met her gaze. Thornwick, the tapestries in the great hall. They depict the history of your house, do they not? Juliana was startled by the sudden change of subject, but managed a nod. Yes. From its founding dot through all the battles. And the women? He pressed, are they shown? The mothers, the wives, the daughters? She blinked, thinking. Yes, but though often in the background. Supporting their men. Healing. Waiting. Waiting, he echoed, and a strange look crossed his face, as if he saw something she did not. Perhaps that waiting is not all they did. He gave a short bow. Sleep well. He left, and Juliana entered her chamber. The echoes of Thornwick, of its women, of their strength and resilience, swirling around her like the lingering scent of wood smoke. She was still a captive, still in danger, but something had shifted within her. She was no longer just waiting. She was searching, and she felt, with a sudden certainty, that the answers she sought were closer than she thought. The past, she realized, held the key to the present. Chapter 8. Beneath the armor. The next few days were quiet, almost eerily so. Edric remained confined to a separate chamber, his fate uncertain. Juliana was allowed to visit him, but their conversations were strained, filled with unspoken accusations and recriminations. She couldn't forgive him for his betrayal, but she also couldn't completely abandon him. He was still her brother, and despite everything, she still loved him. Rhys was distant. He avoided her, spending most of his time with his men, preparing for the inevitable conflict with Elmsworth. She saw him only in passing, a fleeting glimpse in the corridor, a brief nod across the courtyard. She sensed that he was deliberately keeping his distance, perhaps out of respect for her feelings, perhaps out of a desire to avoid any further complications. She found herself missing their conversations, their strange, unsettling connection. She missed his intensity, his quiet strength, the way he looked at her, as if he were seeing beneath her skin, to the core of her being. She spent her time reading, walking in the courtyard, and thinking. She thought about her life at Thornwick, about her family, about her future. She thought about Rhys, about his scars, about the burden he carried. She thought about the women of Thornwick, their hidden strength, their resilience. One afternoon, as she was sitting in the courtyard, sketching in a small notebook she had found in the library, she saw Rhys approaching. He was dressed in his full armor, his helmet tucked under his arm, his sword at his hip. He looked formidable, a warrior ready for battle. He stopped before her, his expression unreadable. Lady Juliana, he said, his voice formal. I am riding out to meet with my scouts. I will likely be gone for several days. She nodded, her heart sinking. She didn't want him to go, didn't want to be left alone with her thoughts, with her fears. Be careful, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. I always am, he said, his voice softer now. He hesitated, then reached out and touched her hand, his fingers brushing against hers. It was a brief, fleeting touch, but it sent a jolt of electricity through her. He withdrew his hand, his expression shifting, becoming more guarded. I have been thinking about what you said, he said, his voice low. About the women of Thornwick. She looked at him, puzzled. What do you mean? You said they were waiting, he said. But perhaps they were doing more than that. Perhaps they were protecting. Juliana remembered their conversation in her chamber, the strange look on his face when he'd echoed her words. She realized that he was seeing something she hadn't, something hidden in the tapestries, in the stories of her family. They were strong, she said, her voice gaining conviction. They had to be. They endured hardship, loss, betrayal. They survived. He nodded, his gaze intense. And they passed that strength on, he said, to their daughters, to their sons. He paused, then looked at her, his eyes filled with a strange mixture of admiration and something else. Something that looked like vulnerability. You have that strength, Lady Juliana, he said, his voice low and rough. I see it in you. She felt a blush rise to her cheeks, a mixture of pride and something else. Something that felt dangerously close to affection. I try, she said, her voice trembling slightly. He smiled then, a fleeting, almost imperceptible curve of his lips, but it transformed his face, softening the harsh lines and making him appear even younger. You do more than try, he said. You succeed. He turned to leave, then paused, looking back at her. I will return, he said, his voice firm. And when I do, we will resolve this. He left, the sound of his armored footsteps echoing in the courtyard. Juliana watched him go, her heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. She felt a strange mixture of fear and hope. She returned to her sketching, her hand moving almost unconsciously across the page. She found herself drawing not the flowers or the birds, but Rhys. His face, his eyes, the way he had looked at her just now. She realized that she was seeing him differently now, seeing beneath the armor, beneath the warrior facade. She was seeing the man, the human being, with his own struggles, his own vulnerabilities. And she was beginning to care for him, deeply, in a way that both terrified and exhilarated her. She stopped drawing, a sudden, vivid image flooding her mind. A tapestry. Not one from Thornwick, but one she had seen in a book, a depiction of a battle, a knight and a woman. The woman, a queen according to the faded caption, not waiting at the sidelines, but there, in the battle, offering comfort, handing the knight his sword. Not passively, but purposefully, her hand steady, her gaze sure. Juliana set the book down. She stood slowly and looked out towards where Rhys had disappeared. She saw the battlefield in her mind. And she saw herself, not waiting in the shadows, but standing beside him, offering him not just comfort, but strength. A strength that had been passed down through generations of women, a strength that was now hers to wield. The thought, the image, was both terrifying and exhilarating. And it solidified something within her, a resolve that had been growing, unseen, for days. She was not just a pawn. She was a player. And it was time she acted like one. Chapter 9. The Dance of Deception. When Rhys returned, it was not with news of victory or defeat, but with a proposal. A tense, carefully orchestrated meeting was arranged in the castle's great hall, a space usually reserved for feasts and celebrations, now heavy with unspoken anxieties. Juliana was summoned, her presence required, not as a captive, but as a participant. She dressed carefully, choosing a gown of deep blue, the color of the twilight sky, a subtle echo of Rhys's eyes. She wore no jewelry, save for a simple silver chain, a gift from her mother, a reminder of her lineage, of her strength. The hall was filled with the key players in this unfolding drama. Rhys, of course, stood at the head of the table, his expression unreadable, his posture radiating a controlled power. Gareth and several of his other trusted men stood behind him, their hands resting on their sword hilts, their faces grim. Elmsworth was there, too, his presence a surprise, a calculated move in this dangerous game. He was flanked by his own men, their expressions equally wary, their hands equally close to their weapons. He stood opposite of Rhys, and at the rounded end of the table between the two men sat Juliana. Edric was not present. He remained confined to his chamber, his fate still hanging in the balance. Lady Juliana, Rhys said, his voice formal, addressing her across the expanse of the table. We are here to discuss your future. Juliana met his gaze, her expression calm, her heart pounding a steady rhythm beneath her breast. She knew this was a performance, a carefully choreographed dance of deception. She had to play her part, had to convince Elmsworth that she was still a pawn, a prize to be won. "My future is in your hands, Sir Rhys," she replied, her voice even, betraying none of the turmoil she felt inside. Elmsworth smiled, a predatory glint in his eyes. "Indeed, it is," he said, his voice smooth and silky. "And I am prepared to offer a generous solution." Rhys ignored him, his gaze fixed on Juliana. "Lord Elmsworth has proposed a marriage," he said, the words carefully chosen, devoid of emotion. "Between himself and you." Juliana pretended to be surprised, widening her eyes, letting a flicker of fear cross her face. "Marriage?" she repeated, her voice trembling slightly. "It is the only way to prevent war," Elmsworth said, his voice persuasive. "To unite our houses, to bring peace to the borderlands." Juliana looked at Rhys, her eyes pleading, her expression conveying a desperate hope that he would refuse, that he would protect her. He met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "It is a possibility," he said, his voice noncommittal. "One that I am considering." Juliana knew he was lying. She knew he would never agree to such a thing, that he would never hand her over to Elmsworth. But he had to maintain the pretense, had to make Elmsworth believe that he was wavering, that he was willing to negotiate. "I offer you wealth, power, a kingdom," Elmsworth said, his voice seductive, his eyes fixed on Juliana. "Become my wife, and you will be Queen of the North." Juliana forced herself to smile, a weak, trembling smile that barely masked her revulsion. "It is a tempting offer, my lord," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I will give you time to consider," Elmsworth said, his smile widening. "But do not delay too long. The fate of your people rests on your decision." He rose, gesturing to his men, and they left the hall, their footsteps echoing in the silence. Juliana remained seated, her gaze fixed on Rhys. She waited for him to speak, to reveal his true intentions. He sighed, his expression shifting, becoming less guarded. "It is a charade, my lady," he said, his voice low. "A dance of deception." "I know," she replied, her voice steady. "But what is your plan?" He leaned closer, his voice barely audible. "I will not marry you to Elmsworth," he said, his voice firm. "But I will make him believe that I am willing to do so. I will use this negotiation to buy us time." "Time for what?" she asked. "Time to gather my forces," he said. "Time to prepare for war. And time," he hesitated, looking directly at her. "To find another way." Juliana's breath caught. "Another way?" He nodded. "There may be a way to secure your freedom and to prevent war that does not involve marriage to Elmsworth," he said, a glimmer of something unexpected in his storm-gray eyes. "How?" He smiled, this time a bit warmer, a hint of the man beneath the warrior's mask. "That, my lady, requires a bit of trust." "And a bit of daring." Juliana felt that spark within her again, that sense of purpose, of agency. She was not just a pawn, she was a player. And she was ready to play her part. "I trust you, Sir Rhys," she said, surprising even herself with the sincerity of her words. He raised an eyebrow, as if surprised too. "Do you now?" A pause. "Then let the dance continue. But be warned, my lady, this dance may lead us to unexpected places." The hall, once filled with tension, now seemed to hum with a different kind of energy, a shared understanding, a nascent alliance. The game was afoot, and Juliana, no longer just a captive, was ready to play. The tapestry of her life was being woven, thread by thread, and she was determined to have a hand in its design. Chapter 10. A Knight's Burden. The days that followed were a tense waiting game. Juliana maintained her facade of compliance, playing the part of the reluctant bride-to-be, while Rhys continued his preparations for war, all the while subtly probing for an alternative solution. Their interactions were brief, guarded, but filled with an unspoken understanding, a shared sense of purpose. She saw him mostly from afar, a figure on horseback, reviewing his troops, a silhouette against the setting sun, conferring with his advisors. She noticed the lines of fatigue around his eyes, the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. He was carrying a heavy burden, the fate of his people, the threat of war, and her own uncertain future. One evening, as she was walking in the courtyard, she saw him standing alone, gazing out at the distant hills. He was not wearing his armor, but a simple tunic, his sword leaning against the wall beside him. He looked vulnerable, less like a warrior and more like a man. She approached him cautiously, her footsteps soft on the grass. He turned, his expression shifting from one of contemplation to something else. Something that looked like relief. "Lady Juliana," he said, his voice low. "I did not hear you approach."
"I did not mean to disturb you," she replied.
"You looked lost in thought." He sighed, his gaze returning to the hills. He said. "I am weighing my options, considering the consequences of my actions." "The war," she said, stating the obvious. He nodded. "It is inevitable, I fear," he said. "Elmsworth will not back down. He is too ambitious, too hungry for power." "And my marriage?" she asked, her voice hesitant. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. "That is a charade," he said, his voice firm. "A means to an end. I will not allow it to happen." Juliana felt a surge of relief, a warmth spreading through her chest. She trusted him, implicitly, and yet, hearing him say the words, confirming his intentions, eased a burden she hadn't realized she was carrying. "But what is the alternative?"
she asked.
"How can we prevent war and secure my freedom without that?" He hesitated, his gaze shifting away from her. "There is a possibility," he said, his voice low. "A dangerous one. One that requires a great deal of trust." "I have told you," she said, her voice stronger now. "I trust you, Sir Rhys." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and something else. Something that looked like affection. "It involves your family," he said, his voice hesitant. "The secrets of Thornwick." Juliana's breath caught. The secrets of Thornwick. She had been thinking about them, too, ever since their conversation about the tapestries, about the women of her lineage. She had a sense that the answers she sought were hidden there, in the past, in the stories that had been passed down through generations. "What secrets?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a confidential murmur. "There are rumors," he said. "Whispers of an ancient pact, a treaty between Thornwick and another power." "Another power?" Juliana repeated, her mind racing. "Who?" "The Northern clans," he said, his voice barely audible. "The Northern clans. The very people Montrose had been fighting for years, the people who were considered their enemies." "But that is impossible," Juliana said, her voice filled with disbelief. "Thornwick has always been loyal to the crown." "Officially, yes," Rhys agreed. "But there are stories. Stories of a hidden alliance, a secret agreement, forged long ago." "What kind of agreement?" she asked. "A pact of mutual protection," he said. "A promise of aid in times of need. A marriage." Juliana stared at him, her mind reeling. "A marriage? Between a woman of Thornwick and a northern chieftain?" "It is said," Rhys continued, "that the pact was sealed with a token, a symbol of their alliance. A locket. A locket." Juliana remembered the recurring motif, the locket from a forbidden lover, a whisper from her own dreams. She felt a shiver run down her spine, a sense of recognition. "Where is this locket now?" she asked, her voice urgent. Rhys hesitated. "That is unknown," he said. "It is believed to be hidden somewhere within Thornwick. Lost to time." Juliana felt a surge of determination. If this locket existed, if it could prove the existence of this ancient pact, it could be the key to preventing war, to securing her freedom. "We must find it," she said, her voice firm. Rhys looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of admiration and concern. "It will not be easy," he said. "Thornwick is heavily guarded. And your father, my father, will not listen to reason," Juliana said, her voice bitter. "He is blinded by his loyalty to the crown, by his hatred of Elmsworth." "But he might listen to you," Rhys said, his voice softer now. "If you could convince him of the truth, if you could show him the locket." Juliana knew it was a long shot, a desperate gamble. But she had to try. She had to find a way to reach her father, to make him see the truth, before it was too late. "I will go to Thornwick," she said, her voice resolute. Rhys looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and something else. Something that looked like love. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow, and she understood, with sudden clarity, that her feelings for him were no longer just respect, or trust, or even affection. They were something deeper, something more profound. She was in love with him, with her captor, with the Lion of the North. And he, she sensed, felt the same way. But there was no time for such thoughts, no time for such emotions. The stakes were too high, the danger too great. "It is too dangerous," he said, his voice rough. "I will not allow it." "You cannot stop me," she said, her voice unwavering. "I am going home."
He knew she was right.
He couldn't stop her. He could only help her. He took a breath, the air filling his lungs, and she watched him shift, the vulnerability fading, replaced by the resolute strength of the knight he was. The burden, she saw, was still there, but now it was shared. Chapter 11. The Price of Freedom. The journey to Thornwick was fraught with peril. They traveled in secret, a small, carefully chosen band, disguised as traveling merchants. Rhys insisted on accompanying Juliana, despite her protests, his presence both a comfort and a source of constant tension. They avoided the main roads, sticking to the less traveled paths, through forests and over hills, their progress slow and arduous. They slept in rough shelters, ate meager rations, and lived in constant fear of discovery. The closer they got to Thornwick, the more Juliana's anxiety grew. She was returning home, not as a conquering hero, but as a fugitive, a traitor in the eyes of her father, a pawn in a dangerous game. She worried about her family, about her mother and younger siblings, about the reception she would receive. Rhys was a constant source of strength, his quiet presence reassuring, his watchful eyes always alert for danger. He rarely spoke, but she felt his support, his unwavering commitment to her safety, to her mission. One evening, as they were camped in a small clearing, deep in the forest, Juliana found herself unable to sleep. She sat by the dying embers of the fire, wrapped in a thick cloak, her mind racing. Rhys sat across from her, his face illuminated by the flickering flames. He was sharpening his sword, the rhythmic rasp of the whetstone a soothing sound in the stillness of the night. "You are troubled," he said, his voice low, not looking up from his task. She nodded, her throat tight. "I am afraid," she admitted. "Afraid of what I will find at Thornwick. Afraid of failing." He stopped sharpening his sword, his gaze meeting hers. "You are not alone," he said, his voice firm. "I am with you." His words, simple as they were, warmed her, easing the knot of fear in her chest. She trusted him, implicitly, and yet, she knew that the ultimate responsibility rested on her shoulders. "If I fail," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "If I cannot convince my father, war will be inevitable." He nodded, his expression grim. "I know," he said, "but you will not fail. You are strong, Juliana. Stronger than you know." He reached out and touched her hand, his fingers brushing against hers. It was a brief, fleeting touch, but it sent a jolt of electricity through her. She looked up at him, her heart pounding. He met her gaze, his eyes filled with a mixture of tenderness and longing. He opened his mouth to speak, then hesitated, as if struggling with his words. "Juliana," he began, his voice rough. He stopped, his gaze shifting away from her. He seemed to be battling some inner demon, some conflict that prevented him from speaking his mind. Juliana felt a pang of disappointment, a yearning for him to say the words she longed to hear. But she also understood his hesitation, his reluctance to express his feelings in the midst of such danger, such uncertainty. "It is all right," she said, her voice soft. "You do not need to say anything." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and regret. "There will be time," he said, his voice low. "When this is over, there will be time for other things." She nodded, her heart filled with a fragile hope. She knew that their journey was far from over, that the challenges ahead were daunting. But she also knew that they faced them together, united by a shared purpose, by a growing bond that transcended their roles as captor and captive. They continued their journey, reaching the outskirts of Thornwick in the pre-dawn hours. The castle loomed before them, a massive silhouette against the lightning sky, its familiar towers and battlements both welcoming and menacing. Juliana felt a surge of emotion, a mixture of longing and trepidation. She was home, but she was also a stranger, an outsider, returning under a cloud of suspicion and uncertainty. Rhys placed a hand on her arm, his touch reassuring. "Remember our plan," he said, his voice low. "Be careful, and trust no one." She nodded, her throat tight. She knew the risks, the dangers that awaited her. She was walking into a lion's den, a place where her own family might be her greatest enemy. But she was also walking into her past, searching for a key, a secret that could unlock her future and the future of the Borderlands. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. The price of freedom, she knew, could be steep, but she was willing to pay it, whatever the cost. The fate of 2 kingdoms and her own heart rested on her shoulders. And as she walked towards the gates of Thornwick, she knew that she was no longer just a lady, a captive, or a pawn. She was a warrior, fighting for her future, fighting for her love, fighting for her home. Chapter 12. Letters from the Lost. Entering Thornwick was like stepping back in time. The familiar sights, sounds, and smells of her childhood home enveloped Juliana, a bittersweet embrace that both comforted and unsettled her. The courtyard bustled with activity, servants rushing to and fro, guards patrolling the walls, the blacksmith's hammer ringing against the anvil. It was all so familiar and yet so different. She was an outsider now, a stranger in her own home. She was met by a stern-faced steward who eyed her with suspicion, her ragged clothes and travel-worn appearance a stark contrast to the finery she had once worn. He demanded to know her business, his voice cold and unwelcoming. "I am Lady Juliana," she said, her voice firm, despite the tremor in her heart. "I have returned home." The steward's expression didn't change, his eyes narrowed with disbelief. "Lady Juliana is a prisoner of Montrose," he said, his voice laced with doubt. "You are an impostor." Juliana had anticipated this, had prepared for this resistance. She reached into a hidden pocket in her cloak, producing a small, silver ring, engraved with the crest of Thornwick. "This was my mother's," she said, her voice steady. "It is a token of my identity." The steward examined the ring, his eyes widening slightly. He recognized the crest, the intricate detail, the undeniable authenticity. He hesitated, then bowed his head, his demeanor shifting from suspicion to deference. "My lady," he said, his voice softer now. "Forgive my impertinence. We had received word that you were dead." Juliana felt a pang of sorrow, a reminder of the deception that had been woven around her. "I am alive," she said, her voice firm, "and I must speak with my father. Immediately." The steward led her through the familiar corridors of the castle, her footsteps echoing on the stone floors. She passed the great hall, where she had once danced and feasted, the tapestry room, where she had spent countless hours learning the art of needlework, her own chamber, where she had dreamed of a future that had never come to pass. Memories flooded her, bittersweet and poignant, reminding her of the life she had lost, the life she was fighting to reclaim. She was taken to her father's solar, a large, richly decorated chamber where he conducted his business, received his advisors, and ruled his domain. Lord Alaric sat behind a massive oak desk, his face etched with lines of worry and fatigue, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. He looked older, more weathered than she remembered, the weight of his responsibilities heavy on his shoulders. He rose as she entered, his expression a mixture of disbelief and anger. "Juliana?" he said, his voice hoarse. "Is it truly you?" "Father," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I have returned." He approached her, his eyes scanning her face, searching for any sign of deception. He saw the familiar features, the same eyes, the same determined chin, but he also saw a change, a new strength, a resilience that hadn't been there before. "They told me you had perished," he said quietly, almost to himself. "I am alive," she said, her voice firmer now. "But I have much to tell you." He gestured to a chair, and she sat down, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. He remained standing, his posture rigid, his expression unyielding. "I have come to warn you, father," she said, her voice urgent. "About Elmsworth. About the war." He scoffed, his eyes flashing with anger. "Elmsworth is a traitor," he said, his voice harsh. "He deserves to be crushed." "He is a threat," Juliana agreed. "But war is not the answer. There is another way." She told him everything about her captivity, about Rhys, about the ancient pact, about the locket. She spoke quickly, urgently, her words tumbling over each other, desperate to convince him of the truth. He listened in silence, his expression unchanging, his eyes fixed on her face. She couldn't tell if he believed her, if he was even considering her words. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant, as if he were looking back at something far away. "You speak of legends," he said, his voice skeptical. "Of stories whispered in the dark. There is no proof." "There is," Juliana insisted. "The locket. It is the proof. We must find it." He shook his head, his expression hardening. "I will not risk the lives of my men on a fool's errand," he said, his voice cold. "I will deal with Elmsworth in my own way." Juliana felt a surge of despair, a sense that she had failed. She had come so far, risked so much, and yet she couldn't reach him, couldn't break through his stubborn pride, his unwavering loyalty to the crown. Suddenly, a new voice spoke, a soft, gentle voice that Juliana hadn't heard in what felt like a lifetime. "Alaric," the voice said, "perhaps we should listen to our daughter." Juliana turned, her heart leaping. Her mother, Lady Alara, stood in the doorway, her face pale and drawn, but her eyes filled with a familiar warmth, a familiar strength. "Mother," Juliana breathed, relief flooding through her. Lady Alara approached, embracing her daughter tightly. "My child," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "You are alive." She released Juliana, turning to her husband, her expression firm, her gaze unwavering. "Alaric," she said, her voice steady. "We must consider this. We must at least investigate." Lord Alaric hesitated, his eyes flickering between his wife and his daughter. He saw the determination in Juliana's eyes, the pleading in Alara's, and he knew that he could not simply dismiss their words. "Very well," he said, his voice grudging. "We will search for this locket. But if it is not found, if this is all a deception, it is not a deception. Father," Juliana said, her voice firm. "I swear it." They began their search in the castle library, a vast, dusty chamber filled with ancient tomes, scrolls, and manuscripts. Juliana remembered spending countless hours there as a child, lost in the stories of knights and dragons, of heroes and villains. They searched for days, poring over old records, family histories, letters from the past. Juliana felt a growing sense of frustration, a fear that the locket was lost forever, that their efforts were in vain. Then, one evening, as she was sifting through a pile of old letters, she found something. A small, leather-bound book, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. It was a journal, written in a familiar hand. Her grandmother's. She opened the journal, her heart pounding, her fingers trembling. She began to read, her eyes scanning the faded ink, the elegant script. The journal entries were filled with the details of her grandmother's life, her thoughts, her feelings, her secrets. And then, towards the end, she found it, a passage that made her breath catch in her throat. "I have hidden it," the entry read, "the token of our alliance, the symbol of our hope. I have hidden it where it will be safe, where it will be found when the time is right. I have hidden it in the heart of Thornwick." The heart of Thornwick. Juliana's mind raced. Where was that? What did it mean? She closed the journal, her heart filled with a renewed sense of hope. She had found a clue, a lead, a path to follow. The locket was not lost. It was waiting to be found, and she knew, with a sudden certainty, where to look. The letters from the lost held the key. Now she just needed to find where they pointed. Chapter 13. The edge of the blade. The heart of Thornwick, Juliana realized, was not a physical location, not a specific room or chamber within the castle. It was something more symbolic, something more essential. It was the source of Thornwick's strength, its resilience, its enduring power. And that, she knew, was the well. The ancient well, located in the center of the inner courtyard, was the oldest part of the castle, predating even the Roman foundations. It was said to have magical properties, to be a source of life and protection for Thornwick. It was the heart of the castle, the heart of her home. She shared her discovery with her mother, who listened with rapt attention, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and apprehension. Lord Alaric remained skeptical, but he agreed to allow them to investigate, his curiosity piqued by the discovery of his own mother's journal. They descended into the courtyard, the air cool and damp, the scent of earth and stone filling their nostrils. The well was a massive structure, its stone walls covered in moss and lichen, its depths shrouded in darkness. Juliana approached the well, her heart pounding, her senses on high alert. She peered into the darkness, trying to see something, anything, that might indicate the presence of the locket. "How will we retrieve it?" Lady Alara asked, her voice hesitant. "The well is deep." Juliana had anticipated this, had brought with her a coil of rope and a small, sturdy bucket. She tied the bucket to the rope, her hands trembling slightly. "We will lower the bucket," she said, her voice steady, "and hope that it catches on something." It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but she had no other option.
She had to try.
She began to lower the bucket, the rope slowly unwinding, the bucket disappearing into the darkness. She felt a growing sense of anticipation, a sense that she was close, so close, to finding what she sought. Suddenly, she felt a tug on the rope, a slight resistance. She stopped, her heart leaping into her throat. I think I have something," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She slowly began to reel in the rope, her hands shaking, her muscles straining. The bucket felt heavier now, as if it were carrying something significant. As the bucket emerged from the darkness, Juliana saw it. A small, wooden box, its surface covered in mud and grime, but its shape unmistakable. She carefully lifted the box from the bucket, her hands trembling with excitement. She opened it, her breath catching in her throat. There it was. The locket. It was a beautiful piece of jewelry, crafted from silver and gold, inlaid with precious stones. It was shaped like a falcon, its wings spread in flight, its eyes gleaming with a fiery intensity. It was the symbol of Thornwick, the symbol of their alliance with the northern clans. Juliana felt a surge of triumph, a sense of vindication. She had found it. She had proven the truth of the ancient pact. She turned to her father, who stood watching her, his expression a mixture of disbelief and awe. "Father," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "This is the proof. This is the key to preventing war." Lord Alaric approached, his eyes fixed on the locket. He reached out and touched it, his fingers tracing the intricate details, the familiar symbol. He was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant, as if he were seeing something far away. "It is real," he said, his voice barely a whisper. The stories, they were true. He looked at Juliana, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and regret. "You have done well, my daughter," he said, his voice firm. "You have saved us all." Juliana felt a wave of relief wash over her, a sense of closure. She had succeeded. She had found the locket. She had convinced her father. She had prevented war. But her triumph was short-lived. Suddenly, a shout rang out from the battlements, a cry of alarm.
"Attack!"
Juliana's blood ran cold. She looked up, her eyes widening in horror. Elmsworth's forces were storming the castle. They had been betrayed. Someone within Thornwick had alerted Elmsworth, had told him of their discovery, had given him the opportunity to strike. The courtyard erupted in chaos, the clash of steel, the screams of the wounded, the roar of battle filling the air. Juliana found herself caught in the middle of a desperate struggle, a fight for survival. She saw her father draw his sword, his face grim, his eyes filled with a familiar fire. He was a warrior, born and bred, and he would defend his home, his family, to the death. She saw her mother, her face pale but resolute, urging the servants to safety, her voice calm amidst the chaos. And then she saw him, Rhys. He had ridden through the gates, his men at his side, their swords flashing in the sunlight. He was fighting his way towards her, his eyes searching for her, his expression filled with a mixture of fury and concern. He reached her, cutting down an Elmsworth soldier who stood in his path. "Juliana," he cried, his voice hoarse. "Are you all right?" She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She was terrified, but she was also relieved. He was here. He had come to help her. "We must get you to safety," he said, his voice urgent. "No," she said, her voice firm. "I will not run. I will fight." She clutched the falcon locket, feeling its weight in her hand. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of admiration and something else. Something that looked like love. There was no time to question it. "Then fight beside me," he said, his voice unwavering. He handed his dagger. The edge of the blade gleamed cold and bright. And she, with the heart of a falcon, with the strength that only comes from protecting what's loved, nodded. The battle raged, but in the heart of the chaos, two figures stood together, their fates intertwined, their love a beacon in the darkness. This was the moment. This was the reckoning. Chapter 14. Beyond the Walls. The fighting was fierce and brutal. The courtyard of Thornwick, once a place of peace and tranquility, was transformed into a bloody battlefield. Juliana fought alongside Rhys, her movements surprisingly agile, her strikes precise. She had never wielded a blade before, but she found a strength within her, a ferocity she didn't know she possessed. The dagger felt like an extension of her own arm, the falcon locket a burning weight against her chest, fueling her resolve. She saw Rhys, a whirlwind of motion, his sword a blur of silver, cutting down Elmsworth's soldiers with ruthless efficiency. He was a force of nature, a warrior in his element, but she also saw the concern in his eyes, the constant vigilance, his unwavering focus on protecting her. She saw her father, fighting with the strength and skill of a much younger man, his face grim, his eyes blazing with defiance. He was defending his home, his family, his legacy. She saw her mother, directing the servants and the women of the castle, tending to the wounded, her face pale but resolute, her voice calm amidst the chaos. The battle raged for hours, the tide turning back and forth. Thornwick's forces were outnumbered, but they were fighting with the courage and determination of those defending their home. Juliana found herself separated from Rhys, surrounded by Elmsworth soldiers. She fought bravely, but she was no match for their numbers, their experience. She felt a sharp pain in her arm, a searing agony that made her cry out. She fell to her knees, her dagger slipping from her grasp. She looked up, her eyes widening in horror. An Elmsworth soldier stood over her, his sword raised, his face twisted with a cruel smile. She closed her eyes, bracing herself for the final blow. But it never came. She heard a roar, a furious cry, and then the sound of steel clashing against steel. She opened her eyes, her vision blurred with pain and tears. Rhys stood between her and the soldier, his sword locked with the other man's, his face a mask of fury. He pushed the soldier back, his movements swift and powerful, and then with a final, decisive thrust, he ran him through. The soldier fell to the ground, dead. Rhys turned to Juliana, his eyes filled with concern. "Juliana," he cried, his voice hoarse. "Are you hurt?" She nodded, her arm throbbing with pain. I think it is broken," she said, her voice trembling. He knelt beside her, his hands gently examining her arm. His touch was surprisingly tender, his expression filled with a mixture of relief and anguish. "We must get you out of here," he said, his voice urgent. "No," she said, her voice firm. "I will not leave.
I will not abandon my family."
"You will be killed," he said, his voice harsh. "You cannot fight." I can help," she said, her voice weak. "I can tend to the wounded." He hesitated, his eyes searching hers. He saw the determination in her eyes, the unwavering resolve, and he knew that he could not force her to leave. He helped her to her feet, supporting her with his arm. "Stay close to me," he said, his voice firm. "And be careful." They made their way to the great hall, where Lady Alara had established a makeshift infirmary. The hall, once a place of feasts and celebrations, was now filled with the moans of the injured, the smell of blood and sweat, the air thick with tension and fear. Juliana, despite her pain, worked alongside her mother, tending to the wounded, binding their injuries, offering them comfort and reassurance. She saw the fear in their eyes, the pain, the desperation, and she felt a surge of compassion, a determination to do whatever she could to help them. As the day wore on, the tide of the battle began to turn. Thornwick's forces, bolstered by Rhys's men, fought with renewed vigor, pushing back Elmsworth's soldiers. The fighting reached a climax in the courtyard, where Rhys and Elmsworth finally faced each other. It was a duel for the ages, a clash between two powerful warriors, their swords flashing in the sunlight, their movements swift and deadly. Juliana watched from the doorway of the great hall, her heart pounding, her breath caught in her throat. She knew that the fate of Thornwick, the fate of the Borderlands, rested on the outcome of this fight. Rhys was the superior swordsman, his skills honed by years of battle, his movements fluid and precise. Elmsworth was strong and ruthless, but he was no match for the Lion of the North. Finally, with a powerful thrust, Rhys disarmed Elmsworth, his sword point pressed against the other man's throat. "Yield, Elmsworth," Rhys said, his voice cold and hard.
"Or die."
Elmsworth glared at him, his eyes filled with hatred, but he knew he was defeated. He slowly lowered his sword, his body trembling with rage and humiliation. Rhys stepped back, allowing Elmsworth to rise. "Leave," he said, his voice dismissive, "and never return." Elmsworth sheathed his sword, his face a mask of fury. He turned and fled, his remaining men following him, disappearing through the shattered gates of Thornwick. The battle was over. Thornwick had been saved. Juliana felt a wave of relief wash over her, a sense of exhaustion and triumph. She had survived. Her family had survived. And Rhys had saved them all. She looked out at the courtyard, littered with the bodies of the dead and wounded, the air still thick with the smell of blood and smoke. It was a scene of devastation, a reminder of the cost of war, the price of freedom. But beyond the walls, beyond the chaos and the carnage, she saw something else. She saw the setting sun, casting a golden glow over the hills, painting the sky with hues of orange and purple. She saw the first stars appearing, twinkling in the gathering darkness. She saw hope. She felt a hand on her shoulder, a gentle touch that made her turn. Rhys stood beside her, his face weary, his armor stained with blood, but his eyes filled with a light that mirrored the stars above. "It is over," he said, his voice soft. She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She leaned against him, her body trembling with exhaustion and relief. He wrapped his arm around her, holding her close, his warmth a comfort in the cold aftermath of battle. They stood there for a long moment, silent, their hearts beating in unison, their love a beacon in the darkness. Chapter 15. The Healer's Touch. The days following the battle were a blur of activity. Juliana, despite her injured arm, threw herself into the task of caring for the wounded, working alongside her mother and the other women of the castle. The great hall, once a scene of carnage, was slowly transformed into a place of healing, a sanctuary for the injured and the grieving. Her arm, though painful, was not broken, thankfully. It was a deep gash, requiring stitches and careful tending. Rhys insisted on tending to it himself, his touch surprisingly gentle, his eyes filled with a concern that went far beyond the duty of a captor or even an ally. He cleaned the wound, his fingers brushing against her skin, sending shivers down her spine. He stitched it closed, his movements precise and efficient, his brow furrowed in concentration. "You are skilled at this," Juliana said, her voice trembling slightly. He looked up at her, his eyes meeting hers. "I have had much practice," he said, his voice low. "In war, one learns many skills. Not all of them pleasant." She saw the sadness in his eyes, the weight of the battles he had fought, the lives he had taken, the wounds he had seen. She realized that he was not just a warrior, but a healer, too, a man who carried the burden of both destruction and restoration. "Thank you," she said, her voice sincere. "For everything." He nodded, his gaze lingering on hers. "You saved Thornwick, Juliana," he said, his voice soft. "You found the locket. You convinced your father." "We saved Thornwick," she corrected, her voice firm. "Together." He smiled then, a fleeting, almost imperceptible curve of his lips, but it transformed his face, softening the harsh lines and making him appear even younger. "Together," he agreed. As the days passed, Juliana's arm began to heal, and her strength returned. She continued to work in the great hall, assisting her mother, offering comfort to the wounded, and watching Rhys. He was everywhere, overseeing the repairs to the castle, organizing the defenses, dealing with the aftermath of the battle. He was a leader, a commander, a man who inspired loyalty and respect. But she also saw the weariness in his eyes, the toll that the fighting had taken on him. One evening, as she was walking through the courtyard, she saw him standing alone, gazing out at the distant hills. He looked lost, his shoulders slumped, his posture devoid of its usual confidence. She approached him cautiously, her footsteps soft on the grass. He turned, his expression shifting from one of contemplation to something else. Something that looked like relief. "Juliana," he said, his voice low. "I did not hear you approach."
"I did not mean to disturb you," she replied.
"You look troubled." He sighed, his gaze returning to the hills. "I am," he said. "I am thinking about the future."
"The future?"
she repeated, her heart quickening. He nodded. "The war with Elmsworth is over," he said. "But the peace, it is fragile. There will be other threats, other challenges." "And Thornwick?" she asked, her voice hesitant. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. "Your father has agreed to honor the ancient pact," he said.
"He has sworn allegiance to me."
Juliana felt a surge of relief, a sense that a great weight had been lifted from her shoulders. Thornwick was safe, secure, allied with Montrose.
"And you?"
she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What will you do?" He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a confidential murmur. "I will return to my lands," he said. "I will rebuild. I will strengthen my defenses. I will prepare for whatever comes next." He paused, then looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of longing and uncertainty. "And what of you, Juliana?" he asked, his voice low and rough. "What will you do?" Juliana's heart pounded in her chest. She knew what she wanted. She wanted to be with him, to stay by his side, to share his life, his burdens, his triumphs. But she also knew that it was not that simple. She was a lady of Thornwick, and he was the Lord of Montrose. Their worlds were different, their paths divergent. "I do not know," she said, her voice trembling slightly. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. His touch was warm and strong, sending a jolt of electricity through her. "Come with me," he said, his voice urgent. "Come to Montrose. Be with me." Juliana's breath caught in her throat. It was the offer she had longed for, the invitation she had dreamed of. But it was also a terrifying prospect, a leap of faith into the unknown. She looked at him, her eyes searching his. She saw the love in his eyes, the sincerity, the unwavering commitment. And she knew that she could not refuse him. She could not deny her own heart. "Yes," she said, her voice firm. "I will come with you." He smiled then, a genuine, heartfelt smile that lit up his face, transforming him from a weary warrior into a man filled with hope and joy. He pulled her close, embracing her tightly, his arms wrapping around her, holding her as if he would never let her go. She rested her head on his chest, her ear pressed against his heart, listening to its steady, reassuring beat. They stood there for a long moment, silent, their bodies entwined, their love a silent promise, a bond that transcended the walls of castles, the boundaries of kingdoms, the scars of the past. The healer's touch had mended more than just her arm. It had mended her spirit, her heart, and had woven a new tapestry, a future filled with love, with hope, with the promise of a life together, beyond the walls of Thornwick, beyond the shadows of war. Chapter 16. Torn Banners, Torn Hearts. The journey to Montrose was a stark contrast to their previous, clandestine trek to Thornwick. They traveled openly, with a full escort of Montrose and Thornwick soldiers, their banners flying proudly, a symbol of their alliance, their unity. But despite the outward display of strength and confidence, Juliana felt a sense of unease, a lingering fear that their newfound peace was fragile, that the shadows of war still loomed. She rode beside Rhys, their hands often brushing, their eyes meeting frequently, sharing a silent understanding, a love that had blossomed in the midst of chaos and conflict. But she also saw the worry in his eyes, the lines of fatigue that etched his face, the constant vigilance that never left him. He was returning home, not to a hero's welcome, but to a land ravaged by war, a people weary and depleted, a castle in need of repair. He was carrying the burden of leadership, the responsibility for the well-being of his people, the constant threat of future attacks. As they approached Montrose, Juliana saw the devastation wrought by the conflict. Fields lay barren, villages were deserted, the scars of battle evident everywhere. The castle itself, though imposing, was damaged, its walls scarred by fire, its towers crumbling. It was a far cry from the pristine beauty of Thornwick, a stark reminder of the cost of war, the price of freedom. The people of Montrose, though wary at first, welcomed Juliana with a mixture of curiosity and respect. They had heard tales of her bravery, of her role in securing the alliance between Thornwick and Montrose, of her love for their lord. They saw her as a symbol of hope, a promise of a better future. Juliana, in turn, was struck by their resilience, their determination to rebuild their lives, their unwavering loyalty to Rhys. She saw the hardship they had endured, the losses they had suffered, but she also saw their spirit, their unwavering hope. She spent her days exploring the castle, learning about its history, its people, its customs. She found it different from Thornwick, less refined, more raw. But she also found it welcoming, a place where she felt a sense of belonging, a sense of purpose. One evening, as she was walking along the battlements, she saw Rhys standing alone, gazing out at his lands. He looked weary, his shoulders slumped, his posture devoid of its usual confidence. She approached him, her footsteps soft on the stone. He turned, his expression shifting from one of contemplation to something else. Something that looked like love. "Juliana," he said, his voice low. "I did not hear you approach." "I did not mean to disturb you," she replied. "You looked lost in thought." He sighed, his gaze returning to the landscape. He said. "I am thinking about everything that has happened. Everything that is yet to come." "It is a lot to bear," she said, her voice soft. He nodded. "I feel the weight of it," he said. "The responsibility. The fear." She stepped closer, placing a hand on his arm. His skin was warm beneath her touch, his muscles tense. "You are not alone," she said, her voice firm. "I am here. We are together." He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. He saw the love in her eyes, the sincerity, the unwavering support. And he felt a surge of strength, a renewed sense of purpose. "I know," he said, his voice softer now. "And that is what gives me hope." He reached out and took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. He pulled her close, embracing her tightly, his arms wrapping around her, holding her as if he would never let her go. She rested her head on his chest, her ear pressed against his heart, listening to its steady, reassuring beat. They stood there for a long moment, silent, their bodies entwined, their love a silent promise, a bond that transcended the scars of the past, the uncertainties of the future. But their peaceful moment was shattered by the arrival of a messenger, a young soldier, breathless and disheveled, his face pale with fear. "My lord," he gasped. "Riders approaching." From the north. Reese's body stiffened, his hand tightening around Juliana's. "How many?" he asked, his voice sharp. "Many, my lord," the messenger replied. "Hundreds. They carry the banner of Clan McAlpin." McAlpin. The name sent a chill down Juliana's spine. They were a powerful northern clan, known for their ferocity, their ruthlessness, their hatred of Montrose.
They were not part of the ancient pact.
Reese had told Juliana tale stories of a vicious raid 10 years prior, led by the McAlpin chieftain, that had nearly decimated the region. It was that very raid in which his elder brother fell. "They are attacking?" Juliana asked, her voice trembling. Reese shook his head. "Not yet," he said, his voice grim. "But they are testing us, probing our defenses." He released Juliana, his expression hardening. "I must go," he said, his voice urgent. "I must rally my men." He turned to leave, then paused, looking back at her. "Stay here," he said, his voice firm. "Stay safe." He left, his footsteps echoing on the stone, disappearing into the depths of the castle. Juliana watched him go, her heart pounding, her mind racing. She was torn between her desire to stay by his side, to help him, and her fear for his safety, for the future of Montrose. She looked at the banners, her own of Thornwick, now side by side with Reese's lion. But the wind carried a new scent, a new threat, and the fabric of their newly formed alliance, like the banners themselves, seemed to fray before her eyes. Chapter 17. A Feast of Secrets. Instead of a direct attack, the McAlpin chieftain, a grizzled old warrior named Torin, sent an envoy requesting a parley. It was a tense, carefully orchestrated meeting held in the Great Hall of Montrose, the same hall where Juliana had tended to the wounded just weeks before. The air was thick with suspicion, with the unspoken threat of violence. Reese, though wary, agreed to the meeting. He knew that engaging in open warfare with the McAlpins would be disastrous, especially with his forces still depleted from the battle with Elmsworth. He had to find another way, a way to avoid bloodshed, to secure peace, however fragile. Juliana insisted on attending the parley, despite Reese's initial objections. She argued that she was no longer just a lady of Thornwick, but a part of Montrose, a symbol of the alliance between their two houses. She had a right to be there, a voice in the negotiations. Reese, seeing the determination in her eyes, relented. He knew that she was strong, resilient, and that her presence might actually be an asset, a reminder of the strength of their combined forces. The Great Hall was prepared for a feast, a strange, unsettling juxtaposition of hospitality and hostility. Long tables were laden with food and drink, but the atmosphere was far from festive. The Montrose and Thornwick soldiers stood guard along the walls, their hands resting on their sword hilts, their faces grim. The McAlpin delegation arrived, a group of hardened warriors, their faces scarred, their eyes filled with a mixture of suspicion and disdain. Torin McAlpin, a towering figure with a long, gray beard and eyes like chips of ice, sat at the head of the table, opposite Reese. Juliana sat beside Reese, her posture straight, her expression calm, but her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. The feast began, a tense, awkward affair. The food was plentiful, but no one seemed to have much of an appetite. The conversation was stilted, filled with veiled threats and thinly disguised insults. Torin McAlpin made his demands clear. He wanted land, tribute, and recognition. He wanted Montrose to acknowledge the McAlpins as the dominant power in the north. Reese, in turn, refused to yield. He would not cede any territory, he would not pay tribute, and he would not bow to any clan. He stood firm, his voice unwavering, his eyes locked with Torin's. Juliana watched them, her mind racing. She knew that this parley was a charade, a dance of deception. Both sides were testing each other, probing for weaknesses, searching for an advantage. She noticed something, a subtle detail that others seemed to have missed. Torin McAlpin kept glancing at her, his eyes lingering on her, a strange expression on his face. It wasn't the leering gaze of a man admiring a woman, but something else, something that looked like recognition. She remembered Rhys's words, the rumors of an ancient pact between Thornwick and the northern clans, a pact sealed with a marriage, a locket. She wondered if Torrin McAlpin knew something about that pact, something that could be used to their advantage. During a lull in the conversation, Juliana spoke, her voice clear and strong, echoing through the hall. "Chieftain McAlpin," she said, her gaze meeting his. "You speak of dominance, of power. But true strength lies not in conquest, but in alliance." Torrin's eyes narrowed, his expression shifting from surprise to curiosity. "And what would you know of alliance, Lady Juliana?" he asked, his voice laced with a hint of sarcasm. "I know that Thornwick and Montrose have forged an alliance," she replied, her voice unwavering. "An alliance based on mutual respect, on shared interests, on a common history." She paused, her gaze lingering on Torrin, her hand unconsciously moving to the falcon locket hidden beneath her gown. "A history that goes back further than you might think," she added, her voice dropping to a confidential murmur. Torrin's eyes flickered, a flicker of understanding. He leaned forward, his voice barely audible. "What do you mean?" he asked. Juliana took a deep breath, steeling herself for what she was about to do. She reached beneath her gown, her fingers closing around the falcon locket. "There are stories," she said, her voice low. "Stories of an ancient pact, a bond between our houses. A bond sealed with a token." She slowly withdrew the locket, holding it up for Torrin to see. The effect was immediate. Torrin's eyes widened, his expression shifting from curiosity to shock. He recognized the locket, the symbol of the ancient alliance. The hall fell silent, everyone's gaze fixed on Juliana and the locket. Rhys looked at her, his expression a mixture of surprise and admiration. Torrin McAlpin rose from his seat, his voice trembling slightly. Where did you get that?" he asked, his eyes never leaving the locket. "It has been passed down through my family," Juliana replied, her voice steady. "4 generations. It is a symbol of a promise of peace." Torrin approached her, his hand reaching out towards the locket. He touched it, his fingers tracing the intricate details, the familiar symbol. "It is real," he said, his voice barely a whisper. The legends, they were true. He looked at Juliana, his eyes filled with a mixture of awe and respect. "You are a descendant of the Falcon's Bride?" he asked, his voice filled with wonder. Juliana nodded, her heart pounding. She had taken a gamble, a desperate risk, and it had paid off. She had used the locket, the secret of Thornwick, to change the course of the negotiations, to shift the balance of power. The feast, once a tense and hostile affair, transformed into something else entirely. A celebration of a rediscovered alliance, a shared history, a hope for a peaceful future. The secrets, revealed at a feast of tension, had changed everything. Chapter 18. The Unveiling. The revelation of the locket and Juliana's lineage had a profound impact on the negotiations. Torrin McAlpin, once a hostile and demanding adversary, became surprisingly amenable, even conciliatory. He explained that the stories of the ancient pact between Thornwick and his clan were not mere legends, but a sacred truth, passed down through generations of McAlpin chieftains. The Falcon's Bride, as she was known in their lore, was a woman of Thornwick who had married a McAlpin chieftain centuries ago, forging an alliance that had secured peace between their peoples for generations. The locket was the symbol of that alliance, a token of their bond, a promise of mutual protection. Torrin believed that Juliana, as a direct descendant of the Falcon's Bride, was a living embodiment of that pact, a symbol of hope for a renewed alliance. He saw her as a key to uniting the northern clans, to ending the cycle of violence and bloodshed that had plagued the region for so long. He proposed a new agreement, a treaty not just between Montrose and the McAlpins, but between all the northern clans, with Thornwick as the mediator, the guarantor of peace. It was a bold, ambitious plan, but it was also a chance to achieve a lasting peace, to secure a future free from the constant threat of war. Rhys, though initially skeptical, was swayed by Torrin's sincerity, by the evidence of the locket, and by Juliana's unwavering belief in the possibility of peace. He saw the opportunity to unite the North, to create a coalition of strength that could withstand any threat, any challenge. The negotiations continued for days, intricate and delicate, involving not just Rhys, Juliana, and Torrin, but also representatives from other northern clans who had been summoned to Montrose to witness this historic event. Juliana played a central role in these discussions, her voice respected, her insights valued, her presence a constant reminder of the ancient pact that bound them together. She spoke of the need for unity, for cooperation, for a shared future. She spoke of the suffering that war had brought, the losses that had been endured, the need to break the cycle of violence. She spoke with passion, with conviction, with the strength of her ancestors flowing through her. Finally, after days of intense negotiations, an agreement was reached. A treaty was drafted, outlining the terms of the alliance, the responsibilities of each clan, the mechanisms for resolving disputes. It was a comprehensive, far-reaching agreement, a testament to the power of diplomacy, of compromise, of a shared vision for a better future. The treaty was signed, sealed, and witnessed by all parties, a historic moment that marked the beginning of a new era for the North. But the unveiling of the ancient pact had another, more personal consequence for Juliana and Rhys. It revealed a truth about their own relationship, a connection that went beyond their individual feelings, their personal desires. They were not just two people who had fallen in love amidst chaos and conflict. They were the embodiment of a centuries-old alliance, the fulfillment of a prophecy, the living proof of a bond that had transcended time and adversity. One evening, as they stood together on the battlements of Montrose, watching the sun set over the hills, Rhys turned to Juliana, his eyes filled with a mixture of awe and love. "You are extraordinary," he said, his voice low. "You have done what no one else could have done. You have brought peace to the North." Juliana smiled, her heart filled with a sense of fulfillment and gratitude. "We did it," she said, her voice soft. "Together." He reached out and took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. His touch was warm and strong, sending a familiar shiver down her spine. "The locket," he said, his voice hesitant. "It was meant for you." "It always was." Juliana nodded, her throat tight with emotion. She felt the weight of the locket, still hidden beneath her gown, a tangible symbol of her heritage, her destiny. "And us," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We were meant to be, weren't we?" Juliana looked at him, her eyes meeting his. She saw the love in his eyes, the sincerity, the unwavering commitment. And she knew that he was right. They were meant to be. Their love was not just a coincidence, not just a product of circumstance. It was something deeper, something more profound, something fated. "Yes," she said, her voice firm. "We were." He pulled her close, embracing her tightly, his arms wrapping around her, holding her as if he would never let her go. She rested her head on his chest, her ear pressed against his heart, listening to its steady, reassuring beat. They stood there for a long moment, silent, their bodies entwined, their love a silent promise, a bond that transcended the walls of castles, the boundaries of kingdoms, the echoes of the past. The unveiling of the locket had not only brought peace to the land, but had also unveiled the truth of their hearts, a love destined to be, a love that would endure. The past, present, and future were intertwined, like the threads of a tapestry, woven together by fate, by courage, and by a love that had conquered all. Chapter 19. The Lion's Roar. The peace, however hard-won, was not universally welcomed. While the majority of the northern clans embraced the new alliance, there were dissenting voices, pockets of resistance, fueled by old grudges, by ambition, by a refusal to accept change. One such voice was Lord Darien, a minor lord whose lands bordered both Montrose and McAlpin territory. He had refused to sign the treaty, openly defying the new alliance, and had begun to gather his forces, preparing for a challenge. He was a thorn in Rhys's side, a constant threat to the fragile peace. Rhys knew that he had to deal with Darien, swiftly and decisively. He could not allow this rebellion to fester, to grow into a larger conflict. But he was also wary of resorting to violence, of breaking the newly forged peace. He discussed the situation with Juliana, seeking her counsel, her insights. She had proven herself to be a wise and astute advisor, her understanding of courtly politics and her intuitive grasp of human nature invaluable. "He is testing you, Rhys," Juliana said, her voice thoughtful. "He is trying to provoke you, to force you into a confrontation." "I know," Rhys replied, his voice grim. "But I cannot ignore him. He is a threat to the peace, to everything we have worked for." "There may be another way," Juliana said, her voice hesitant. "A way to deal with him, without resorting to violence." "What way?" Rhys asked, his eyes searching hers. "Diplomacy," Juliana said. "Negotiation. But not with you." Rhys looked at her, puzzled.
"Who then?"
"With me," Juliana said, her voice firm.
"Let me speak to him."
"Let me try to reason with him." Rhys was initially opposed to the idea. It was too dangerous, he argued. Darian was a ruthless, unpredictable man, and he would not hesitate to harm her. But Juliana persisted, arguing that she had a unique advantage. She was a woman and a lady of Thornwick, a symbol of the Alliance, a representative of the ancient pact. Darian might be more willing to listen to her, to consider her words, than he would be to Rhys. Finally, reluctantly, Rhys agreed. He knew that Juliana was strong, resilient, and that she had a gift for diplomacy, a way of connecting with people, of persuading them to see reason. He also knew that he could not protect her from every danger, that she had to be allowed to make her own choices, to play her own role in this unfolding drama. Juliana, accompanied by a small escort of Montrose and Thornwick soldiers, rode to Darian's castle, a grim, forbidding fortress that reflected its owner's personality. She was met with suspicion and hostility, but she remained calm, her demeanor regal, her voice unwavering. She demanded to speak with Darian, and after a tense standoff, she was granted an audience. Darian was a cruel-looking man, his face scarred, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and ambition. He received Juliana in his great hall, a cold, drafty chamber that lacked the warmth and hospitality of Montrose or Thornwick. "Lady Juliana," he said, his voice laced with sarcasm, "what brings you to my humble abode?" "I have come to speak to you about peace, Lord Darian," Juliana replied, her voice steady. "About the future of the North." He scoffed, his eyes flashing with contempt.
"Peace?" he said.
"There is no peace with Montrose. There is only submission." "That is not true," Juliana said, her voice firm. "The alliance is based on mutual respect, on shared interests, on a common goal." "The goal of making Montrose king of the North?" Darian retorted, his voice rising. "I will not bow to him. I will not be his vassal." "He does not seek to be king," Juliana said. "He seeks only to unite the clans, to protect our lands from our common enemies." "Enemies?" Darian laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "The only enemy I see is Montrose." Juliana took a deep breath, steeling herself for what she was about to say. "There are greater enemies, Lord Darian," she said, her voice low. "Enemies who threaten us all. Enemies from beyond the border." Darian's expression shifted, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. "What enemies?" "The southern kingdoms," Juliana said. "They're growing stronger, more ambitious. They covet our lands, our resources. They will not hesitate to invade, to conquer, to enslave us." Darian was silent for a moment, his gaze distant, as if he were considering her words. "And you believe Montrose can protect us?" he asked, his voice skeptical. "Not alone," Juliana said. "But together, united, we can withstand any threat. We can secure our future, our freedom." She paused, then looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of pleading and determination. "Lord Darian," she said, her voice soft, "I understand your pride, your ambition. But I urge you to consider the greater good. To think of your people, of their future. To join us, to be a part of this alliance, to help us build a better world." Darian was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on Juliana, his expression unreadable. She couldn't tell if she had reached him, if her words had had any impact. Finally, he spoke, his voice low, his words measured. I will consider your words, Lady Juliana, he said. But I make no promises. It was not a victory, but it was not a defeat either. It was a reprieve. A chance to continue the dialogue, to find a way to bridge the gap, to secure peace. Juliana returned to Montrose, exhausted but hopeful. She had planted a seed of doubt in Darian's mind, a seed of hope for a peaceful resolution. Rhys greeted her with a mixture of relief and pride. He had listened to reports of her meeting with Darian, and he was impressed by her courage, her diplomacy, her unwavering commitment to peace. You did well, Juliana, he said, his voice soft. You have given us a chance. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. He pulled her close, embracing her tightly, his arms wrapping around her, holding her as if he would never let her go. She rested her head on his chest, her ear pressed against his heart, listening to its steady, reassuring beat. They stood there for a long moment, silent, their bodies entwined, their love a silent promise, a bond that had been tested, strengthened, and reaffirmed. But even in their embrace, Juliana heard it. A distant rumble, like thunder. But it wasn't thunder. It was the sound of approaching hooves, of many horses. Darian, it seemed, had made his decision, and the Lion of Montrose, standing beside his falcon bride, prepared to roar. Chapter 20. The Reckoning of Love and Duty. The sound of approaching hooves was not Darian's army, as they had initially feared. It was a delegation from the southern kingdoms, a group of richly dressed nobles, escorted by a company of heavily armed knights. They carried the banner of King Edward, the ruler of the most powerful of the southern kingdoms, a man known for his ambition, his ruthlessness, and his expansionist policies. The arrival of the southern delegation threw Montrose into a state of high alert. Rhys, though wary, agreed to receive them, knowing that refusing to do so would be seen as an act of aggression, a provocation for war. The great hall was once again prepared for a meeting, but this time, the atmosphere was even more tense, more charged with unspoken threats. The Montrose and Thornwick soldiers stood guard, their faces grim, their hands resting on their sword hilts. The northern clan chieftains, who had remained at Montrose to solidify their alliance, were also present, their expressions wary, their eyes filled with suspicion. The southern delegation was led by Lord Falkirk, a smooth-talking, sophisticated nobleman, known for his diplomatic skills, but also for his duplicity. He greeted Rhys with a courteous bow, his voice filled with honeyed words, but his eyes cold and calculating. Lord Montrose, he said, his voice smooth. We come in peace, bearing greetings from King Edward. And what is the purpose of your visit, Lord Falkirk? Rhys asked, his voice formal, his expression unreadable. We have heard rumors, Falkirk replied, his voice carefully chosen. Rumors of an alliance, of a unification of the northern clans. The North is at peace, Rhys said, his voice firm. We have formed an alliance to protect our lands, our people. An alliance that could be seen as a threat, Falkirk said, his voice laced with a hint of menace. To the southern kingdoms. We have no desire for war, Rhys said. We seek only to live in peace, to secure our borders. Peace is a fragile thing, Lord Montrose, Falkirk said. It requires trust. And cooperation. He paused, then looked at Rhys, his eyes filled with a mixture of calculation and something else. Something that looked like an offer. King Edward is a generous man, Falkirk said. He is willing to recognize your alliance, to offer you his protection, in exchange for a token of your loyalty. And what token is that? Rhys asked, his voice wary. Falkirk smiled, a slow, predatory smile that sent a chill down Juliana's spine. A marriage, he said, his voice soft. A union between your house and the royal family. Juliana's heart leaped into her throat. She knew what was coming, the demand that would test their love, their loyalty, their alliance. And who would this bride be? Rhys asked, his voice dangerously calm. Falkirk's gaze shifted to Juliana, his eyes lingering on her, a flicker of triumph in his expression. Lady Juliana of Thornwick, he said, his voice clear and strong, echoing through the hall. She is to be wed to King Edward's heir, Prince Richard. The hall fell silent, everyone's gaze fixed on Juliana, on Rhys. The demand was outrageous, a blatant attempt to undermine the alliance, to control the North, to claim Juliana as a prize of war. Juliana felt a surge of anger, of defiance. She would not be a pawn in their game, a prize to be bartered, a tool to be used. She looked at Rhys, her eyes pleading, her heart aching. She saw the fury in his eyes, the pain, the struggle between his love for her and his duty to his people. He stepped forward, his voice a low growl, his hand moving towards his sword hilt. "Never," he said, his voice filled with a barely controlled rage. "I will never agree to such a thing." Falkirk's smile vanished, replaced by a look of cold anger. "You dare refuse the king's offer?" he said, his voice rising. "This is an insult, an act of rebellion." "It is an act of defiance," Rhys retorted, his voice unwavering. "I will not sacrifice Juliana to your king's ambition. I will not betray our alliance." "Then you choose war," Falkirk said, his voice harsh. "You choose the destruction of your lands, the death of your people." "We choose freedom," Rhys said, his voice ringing with conviction. "We choose to fight for our right to exist, for our right to love, for our right to determine our own destiny." He drew his sword, the steel flashing in the torchlight, the sound echoing through the hall. "Leave," he said, his voice cold and hard. "And tell your king that the North will not bow. Tell him that Montrose, Thornwick, and the northern clans stand united. Tell him that we are ready to fight." Falkirk glared at him, his eyes filled with hatred, but he knew that he had been defeated. He turned and left, his delegation following him, their footsteps echoing in the silence. Rhys sheathed his sword, his body trembling with the force of his emotions. He turned to Juliana, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and sorrow. "I am sorry, Juliana," he said, his voice hoarse. "I have endangered you. I have brought war upon us." "No," Juliana said, her voice firm. "You have done what is right. You have protected me. You have defended our love." She stepped forward, embracing him tightly, her arms wrapping around him, holding him as if she would never let him go. He rested his head on her shoulder, his body shaking with the release of tension, the burden of responsibility. They stood there for a long moment, silent, their bodies entwined, their love a silent promise, a bond that had been tested to its limits, but had emerged stronger, more resilient. The hall erupted in cheers, the northern clan chieftains, the Montrose and Thornwick soldiers, all raising their voices in a roar of approval, of support, of unity. They had chosen love, they had chosen freedom, they had chosen to fight. The reckoning of love and duty had come, and they had faced it together, their hearts intertwined, their destinies forever linked. The lion had roared, the falcon had soared, and the North stood united, ready to face whatever the future held. Epilogue. The war with the southern kingdoms was long and brutal, testing the strength and resilience of the Northern Alliance to its limits. But united under the banners of Montrose, Thornwick, and the MacAlpin clan, they fought with a courage and determination that surprised their enemies. Rhys, with Juliana at his side, proved to be a brilliant strategist and a fearless leader, inspiring his troops and rallying the northern clans. Juliana, no longer just a lady or a captive, became a symbol of hope and resilience, tending to the wounded, organizing supplies, and even, on occasion, taking up arms to defend their cause. She was the heart of the alliance, the embodiment of their shared purpose, their unwavering commitment to freedom. The final battle took place on the plains near the border, a clash of armies that would determine the fate of the North. Rhys, leading the charge, fought with the ferocity of a lion, his sword a blur of silver, his courage unmatched. Juliana, watching from a nearby hill, held her breath, her heart pounding with fear and pride. The battle raged for hours, the tide turning back and forth. But finally, the northern forces, fueled by their love for their land, their loyalty to their leaders, and their belief in their cause, prevailed. The southern army was routed, their king captured, their ambitions crushed. The victory was hard-won, the cost high. Many lives were lost, many wounds inflicted, many scars left behind. But the North was free, their alliance secured, their future theirs to shape. Rhys and Juliana returned to Montrose, not as conquerors, but as liberators, as leaders who had guided their people through darkness and into the light. They were greeted with cheers, with tears of joy, with the gratitude of a people who had found their freedom. They stood together on the battlements of Montrose, overlooking their lands, their people, their future. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the hills, painting the sky with hues of orange and purple. Rhys turned to Juliana, his eyes filled with love, with gratitude, with a profound sense of peace. "We did it," he said, his voice soft. "We saved the North." Juliana smiled, her heart overflowing with love for him, with pride in what they had accomplished. "We did it," she agreed. "Together." He reached out and took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. He pulled her close, embracing her tightly, his arms wrapping around her, holding her as if he would never let her go. She rested her head on his chest, her ear pressed against his heart, listening to its steady, reassuring beat. They were married in the spring, in a ceremony that united not just two people, but two houses, two kingdoms, two destinies. The great hall of Montrose was filled with guests from all corners of the North, from Thornwick, from the McAlpin clan, from all the clans who had joined their alliance. Juliana wore a gown of white silk, embroidered with the falcon of Thornwick and the lion of Montrose, their symbols intertwined, a representation of their union, their love. Rhys wore a tunic of dark green, the color of his house, the silver lion rampant gleaming on his chest. They exchanged vows, their voices clear and strong, their eyes locked in a gaze of unwavering love, of eternal commitment. They were not just pledging their love to each other, but their loyalty to their people, their dedication to their lands, their promise to build a future together, a future of peace, of prosperity, of enduring love. Years passed, and their love grew stronger, their bond deeper. They ruled Montrose and Thornwick wisely and justly, their names whispered with respect and admiration throughout the land. They had children, sons and daughters who inherited their parents' strength, their courage, their love. And as they stood together, years later, on the same battlements where they had faced so many challenges, so many uncertainties, they looked out at their lands, at their people, at their legacy, and they knew that they had built something lasting, something beautiful, something that would endure for generations to come. The falcon and the lion, together, had created a kingdom of love, of peace, of enduring strength. Their tapestry was complete. The end.